Once again, thank you for joining us this morning, everyone. Please join us in the conference center as we return to day 3 of APE Meets Silicon Valley, sponsored by Sutter Health. This morning's first session, Increasing Innovation Through Board Diversity in the Pacific Rim. Please welcome to the stage Chitra Nayak, board member for Infosys. Carolyn Tsay, board of directors, Coca-Cola Company. Vanessa Liu, member of the board of directors for Harvard University. Buck Gee, regional chair, member of board of directors for the Committee of 100. G. And our moderator, Tina Shah Paikede, managing director at Russell Reynolds.
Great, well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here with you. And we have a great panel conversation set up. I'm going to ask if we could share the presentation to begin with, and we'll go ahead and introduce our panel. So as I mentioned, I'm a partner in Russell Reynolds' San Francisco office. I lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion practice globally, and I am joined by 4 phenomenal directors. And I'm going to pass it off to each of them to introduce themselves and the roles that they play. But before I do that, the objective for today is really to share with you all a little bit of a comparative analysis with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion on boards in the US and California, specifically relative to the APEC countries. And the directors here serve on both global boards, California boards, US boards, and of course, they represent Asia Pac as well. So I'll pass it off to you, Carolyn, next.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tina. It's so nice to see everyone. My name is Caroline Tsay, and I'm originally from Silicon Valley, live in Mountain View, California. I've always grown up in tech, worked for companies like IBM, Yahoo, and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Also founded my own venture capital-backed company, and currently serve on the boards of Morningstar in the financial services space, not the meat company, but also the Coca-Cola Company. And I serve on the audit committees for both, as well as nominating governance for Morningstar.
Terrific. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Vanessa Liu. I'm based in New York City, and I've been straddling corporates and startups throughout my career. I was at McKinsey for a decade. I was at SAP running their early stage accelerators, also founded 2 companies and also a co-founder and CEO of another company right now called Sugarwork. I also sit on 3 boards. So in addition to being on the Harvard University board, I also sit on the boards of Goodman Group, which is an industrial real estate company based out of Sydney, and Appen, which is a training data AI company also based out of Sydney.
Welcome, Vanessa. Over to you, Chitra.
Hello, I'm Chitra Nayak, and I currently serve on 3 public boards. One is Infosys, which is a global IT services delivery company out of India. One is a medical genetics company called Invitae, and one is an asset-light trucking and logistics company. I also have a couple of SaaS-based VC-backed boards in the background there. I also co-founded a South Asian Professional Women's Network about 4 years ago with the intent, and we have some of our members here, of bringing up the South Asian female community, the professional women's community. That's always been a passion of mine. I also co-created and co-taught a class in women in leadership at the California State University, and I started the Salesforce Women's Network. So it's a thing for me. Over to you, Buck.
Hi, I'm Buck G, and I'm retired. I spent almost 40 years in Silicon Valley in tech, worked at big companies like Cisco and HP, but really most of my life was spent in startups. I did 6 startups. I lost 3 of them, lost a lot of money for venture capitalists, and 3 others. Then we did 3 other liquidity events and made other venture capitalists a lot of money. So. But I retired a few years ago, and I'm just serving on nonprofit boards. You know, I've had it with the for-profit, so I'm giving back. So now I'm on the board of Asia Society in Northern California, on the board of an organization called the Chinatown Media and Arts Collective, which is basically putting up a new $27 million building, Grant and Clay in Chinatown to try to spur development in Chinatown. And I'm also on the board of an organization called Committee of 100, which is a organization of prominent Chinese Americans. I just termed off the Angel Island board. I'm sorry we can't see the Angel Island from here, where I spent 12 years as, that's a long time, as board chair.
Terrific. Well, welcome, Buck. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to talk about a few topics today. We'll start with the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why is this important in the first place for boards? We'll talk a little bit about the relative statistics as it comes to diversity on boards. And we define diversity in the first place, especially in different parts of the world. We will also talk about the importance or lack thereof for diversity legislation and what results it has produced, followed by a little bit of a discussion on board composition more broadly, as well as current governance trends. So we'll start with the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our research all shows that diversity on board leads to better problem solving, reduced risk, better financials. I think our friends at BCG and McKinsey have done a lot of analysis around EBITDA being improved as a result of better decision-making through different perspectives on the board. And lastly, but not least, especially here in Silicon Valley, the innovation diversity on boards can lead to. So my first question is for you, Caroline. How is diversity important for global multinationals such as Coke when they operate locally?
Yeah, and I would argue that it's important for businesses that are maybe more regional focused as well. But you think about a business like the Coca-Cola company, where we operate in almost 250 markets across the world. Right? There's a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of the consumers and the customers we serve, along with the governments and the profiles of what people are looking for in our products. So it's absolutely critical that we have diversity on the board so that that gets filtered down into the executives and the different ranks inside of the organization. We've seen that our marketing campaigns are messaged and tailored differently as a result, right? We've seen how technology may be influenced, including the discussions about AI and bias or non-bias. So it's just a strong business case to make sure that we resonate and build products, market to our consumers in a way that can truly reach them. And then in another case with my other board, one big thing that we stress in our mission is around independent research and building trust, right? And it's hard to be independent or unbiased if the board is not representative of a number of different groups and backgrounds in terms of diversity. So I think when you want to do business with a company and look at that business in terms of their marketing, product development, the talent, and how that kind of matches you as a consumer or customer, these are elements that are important.
All really important points, especially as it relates to consumer markets and businesses. But I think also, Vanessa, you made the point that it's really important for B2B companies. You're serving on a couple of ASX listed boards in Australia. Would love to hear that perspective as well.
Absolutely. So one of the companies I sit on is a training data AI company. So we tag images. We are creating the training data for a lot of the AI models for very prominent companies, particularly here in the US. And just a concrete example of the importance of diversity, I think, Caroline, you just mentioned bias in AI. That's something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So for instance, if you're tagging images and you're tagging people based on skin color, if you're tagging faces, we have to be able to make sure that we are making sure that all of our methodologies are as diverse as possible, all-encompassing as possible, especially when you just see the data that facial recognition software, for instance, is 10 to 100 times less effective in identifying people who are Black or Asian. And so having that voice, it's interesting because I'm actually the only person of color, even though I'm one of several women who've been on the board for a long time until recently another person to me, but I was actually the only person bringing this up on the board. And you have to make sure that the voices are represented at the tables when you are crafting what is going to be incredibly impactful new technologies that are being deployed.
An interesting example, especially as AI turns our world upside down and in between. Chitra, you talked a little bit about how diversity can lead to better decision-making or innovation. Can you give us an example of how one of your boards has basically illustrated this.
It's interesting that if you read about the evolution of the role of the board, there's this whole nose in, fingers out. They tended to be more a little bit of fiduciary responsibility, but increasingly over time, I think the board has become more involved in active conversations with the executive team. And this is where I think there's enormous opportunity. So for instance, if you think about geographic diversity on the Infosys board, one example of where that's led to potentially strong growth opportunities is we have board members. Of our 7 board members, 2 are in the US and 2 are in Europe and the UK. And when we had this whole discussion around, as an IT services delivery company, what could Infosys do more of to get a seat at the CXO table? One of the things Infosys does incredibly well and has won many awards for is its work on sustainability, on climate, on data center energy management, on a whole host of things. But they really hadn't taken it to their customers. And I think the board conversation with the executive team has led to a strong focus now on that whole initiative that says, how do they take everything that Infosys does so well and take it out there? And some of it was because board members from the US and Europe, where most of their business is, actually reinforced how much, from a regulatory standpoint, it was becoming a very strong C-level discussion.
No, thank you for that. Anything to add, Buck, before we turn to Caroline?
That I want to say?
Yes.
Oh, sure. So Tina knows I'm always a bit of a contrarian, and try to, at least as a leader, you try to have a different view of things. And my view is that I never looked at it as an objective. I look at lack of diversity as a question. You know, what are we doing wrong so there aren't more women, aren't more minorities? Because unless you believe that the only people qualified to be on boards are tall white men, then you ask the question, why are we not getting them? So again, that's the question I ask, is what are we doing, what are we not doing that we should be doing?
Yeah.
Because there are people out there. And so if they're not in your network, what are you doing so you find them? So that's the question, what are we doing that's not getting the right people? Because the tall white men are good enough. I'm sure they're all good enough. The question, are there better people who don't look like them? That's my question.
I love that. And we'll look at the numbers in just a second. Before we turn to them, Caroline, I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of research around adding, one person who is of a different background doesn't necessarily lead to more opinions being heard. Maybe it's additive to add 2 or 3. How have your boards addressed this topic around more than one or shifting perhaps to inclusion?
Yeah, so I can say that I'm lucky, or maybe that's not the best word, but because it should just be, that my board work has been with boards with a majority of women on them, which is unusual. I think the discussion around diversity is not just like, let's stick somebody who checks off a box onto the board, and now we've got diversity, right? I think from personal experience, when you're the only diverse candidate, whether that is, age or functional expertise, regional expertise, race, ethnicity, et cetera, and I know we'll talk more about that, then you can often feel left out or alone, right? And I think truly to achieve diversity, you need kind of voice in numbers. You need a cohort or a group to be able to build that voice and have your opinions heard in the boardroom. So I am truly an advocate of thinking about diversity in numbers, not just kind of that one person and sticking that on a board.
I love that. And ideally, we'll be able to move to a place where we can have more inclusive conversations and draw out those minority opinions so that we can get to the 1 + 1 = 3 scenario. I want to share a little bit of data with you. There's multiple types of diversity. The one that's easiest to measure is gender diversity. And so what we have led is, what does gender diversity on boards look like around the world? You'll see that the Americas for large companies is just under 30%. Europe has made far more progress in many countries, and a large part of that is due to the legislation that they put in place, but it's not all been legislation. In the UK, there's been a Parker review that's more about transparency and reporting. And then lastly, Asia-Pac is putting a lot of legislation in place, which we'll talk about in just a moment, more recently. And so more progress to be made with China and Japan, about 15% women on boards. Australia, you'll see, is leading the pack at 35%. That hasn't always been the case. And maybe, Vanessa, I'll turn to you since you're serving on 2 different Australian boards. What do your boards look for in terms of diversity?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, for Australia, there's no mandate in place. And so that number has gone from 9% in 2009 to 35% now. And it's for a variety of factors. I think a lot of it is the fact that board chairs are looking to make sure that whoever it is that they nominate are going to be diverse. And diversity, though, in Australia is defined primarily by gender. Unfortunately, it's not by ethnicity. And institutional investors are looking at it because they can actually say to a company, we're not going to support the renomination of your chair if they don't do that. And there's also been a lot of pressure from the press. There's also the Australian, their equivalent of the National Association of Corporate Directors, their equivalent in Australia. It's also heavily scrutinizing these numbers. But we look for a mix of skills, certainly gender diversity, and also graphic representation on both of our boards. So on the Goodman board, so we create the warehouses for Amazon or the data centers for Microsoft and all these companies around the world. Geographic representation is incredibly important, but the gender lens is also something that is really top of mind for the company. So 4 of the 5 past appointments over the last 2 years have been women directors. 3 of the 5 of us are overseas directors, overseas from the perspective of Australia. On Appen, most of the business is actually done here in the US, but interestingly enough, over the last 2 years also, out of the 3 appointments that we had, 2 out of the 3 were women, 2 out of the 3 were also overseas appointments, just really reflecting where the business is. And so I think it's always multifaceted when boards and the nom-coms are looking at where are we going to fill in the roles. But the Australia context is just fascinating to see that there was no mandate, but these numbers are reported. And the ESG mandates, a lot of institutional investors are looking for, they're looking specifically at this representation, which has really shot up that number over the years. Really interesting.
Caroline, would love to hear your perspective on sort of other types of diversity you might be looking for on the boards. There's, research that shows that if you put a bunch of lawyers and MBAs on a board, you're less likely to go bankrupt. If you put science and humanities on the board, you're more likely to go IPO. Combination of that's pretty powerful. So I'm curious how you think about this.
Yeah, so we've touched on gender diversity a bit, certainly racial, ethnic diversity. And truly, when you're on a board, you may be an operational executive or have been, and so functional expertise, regional expertise, right? All these elements that may reflect your business, reflect your customers, I think are a part of the discussion and consideration. And another aspect too is even age or generational diversity, right? So I've personally experienced that with one of my boards, thinking about how different generations of consumers consume beverages, the health concerns they might have, and then of course what that means, right, in terms of marketing, product development, and all the other key areas to the business. So I think there are so many facets of what diversity can mean to a particular business that really should be considered.
That's terrific. And Chitra, as it comes to recruiting new board directors, how are your boards factoring diversity into that equation?
As I think Vanessa and Caroline have shared, it really is about the and. Right? So being very intentional, I'm on the Nom/Gov committee of some of my boards, intentional about the composition of your board. What is the mix you want? Is there a customer on there? Is there an industry expert on there? Is there increasingly an IT person who can help you with cyber on there? Is there a digital transformation person on there? So there's a range of different capabilities. The Infosys board actually brought on a retired Egon Zehnder talent partner because they have 350,000 people around the world, and talent is enormously important to them. So it's really looking at the composition of what you have and being very intentional about who the next person is. So the and really is the answer, because as you said, it's a combination of what skill are you looking at, and can you find a diverse candidate who maybe has the geographical diversity. If you play in multiple countries, you can find somebody, to Buck's question, that answers all those questions. You're not saying, I'm going to find a woman, but on my US trucking company board, basically there are 10 board members, independent board members, of which 4 are women. 4 of them are ethnically diverse. And they did that because each of those people has another superpower, right? So they weren't going out to look just for that woman or that Hispanic person or that Black person. We have them all on there, but and would be my response.
Love the end.
Can I tell my Hollywood anecdote, just because
Of course, yes.
about being overt about looking. So I was on a panel a few years ago, talking about lack of diversity in media, in tech, and so on. And there was a panel with a couple of talent agents from Los Angeles. And they told a story that a few years ago, they had written a TV pilot with one of the characters was a tall, good-looking Asian man, okay? So they went to their talent agent and said, go find me a tall, good-looking Asian man. They came back 2 weeks later and said, I'm sorry, we couldn't find any tall, good-looking Asian men. So the producers, and this is Los Angeles, and so the producers got so mad, they went out, and 2 days later, they came up with a list of tall, good-looking Asian men to give the talent guys. So again, unless you look for them, a lot of the problem is you fall back to who you know. It's friends and family. And a lot of us aren't in those friends and family networks. To your point, so unless you have a goal and do it, right, and insist on it, it may not happen. Because it's the easy way out.
Yeah, I have to add a little more, if I may.
Please do.
I was reading a few years ago, one of the women who was a Caucasian woman on the Bed Bath & Beyond board actually made a really interesting comment. She said, well, boards were full of white males, and then they said, go find somebody else. And so they turned to the people they know, their wives, their sisters, their friends, who were white women. And so she was just talking about this whole, how can you be more intentional and go beyond that next step?
That's great. And I know we have many allies in the room, so having this conversation amongst a diverse group is really important. I think we all know each other from an organization called Ascend Pinnacle, and you've been working with Ascend Pinnacle for a long time, Buck.
Right.
Could you tell the audience a little bit about that organization and the advocacy work that you're doing?
Sure. Ascend is an organization, just a little bit of background. Ascend was an organization that was founded in New York, originally called the National Association of Asian American Financial Professionals. And it was started by the big 4 accounting firms and a couple of banks in New York City about 10, 15 years ago. The accounting firms, well, they realized about 20% of the incoming associates were Asian, men and women. And that by the 3rd year, it's up or out in accounting, most of the 20% were going out. So they realized that something was going on in the organization. So they created this organization to try to help Asian American professionals understand what it took to be a manager and leader in large corporate organizations. So that was how it was founded. It changed its name to Ascend when it realized that not all Asians work in banks and accounting firms. But one of the things they did a few years ago was realize there was a problem in directors. Okay, very few Asian Americans in directors. So they created a training program called Pinnacle. They do a 2-day workshop, and then started building a network of Asian American directors. So that part of the problem was aspiring directors to understand what it takes, and number 2, getting into the networks so they know people who can refer them, and number 3, creating the awareness at the director level that there is a need for Asian Americans on the director level. So there really is an ongoing effort. In fact, I think the next session is like next February or March or something in New York. So yeah, there's an ongoing effort by Ascend to create more opportunities for Asians and board levels. And that's what it takes.
Yeah, no, creating that network and making sure that it's known to folks like us. Let's turn gears a little bit to legislation. There's been a lot of legislation recently, especially in Asia-Pac. Things like companies in Hong Kong will not be allowed, if they're going IPO, to have a single gender board. There's been legislation in place for some time in India. We talked earlier about Australia not necessarily having legislation, but having a big push towards measurable results on diversity. As we look at that compared to what's happened in California, many of you may be familiar with the diversity on boards legislation for both women and underrepresented minorities. Some of that has been dismantled in recent times. The NASDAQ rule for diversity transparency reporting has been upheld. And there's a new piece of legislation that recently passed last month for diversity on private company executive teams and a reporting requirement through SB 54 here in California. So a lot of work around legislation. And my question is first for Chitra, how has legislation impacted diversity on boards in India?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think companies that think about their financial performance and their sustainability already is thinking about diversity on boards, right? So it's been since 2015 that if you're a listed company, you have to have one female independent director. But for example, Infosys has 2. And even though they had 6 board members for a $70 billion company, it's interesting, they only had 6, of which 2 were women. And they've consistently, despite when somebody retired off the board, they've consistently kept 2 women on the board because they see the value of that. So I would say clearly having legislation in place helps to open the aperture, as it were, such that people think about that and you have companies like Infosys that are going above and beyond because they actually see the value. They have, a former CEO of a $1 billion company just stepped off the board. They have myself, who comes with 8 years from the Silicon Valley Salesforce experience. The newest person on the board is a woman who comes out of very senior roles at Microsoft, who serves on European and US boards. So again, they see that value outside of the legislation.
It's great to see that shift towards independent directors in the last couple of years as well.
Yeah.
I think has been a big push. Buck, you've been very involved here in
Sure.
California. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to with respect to the legislation.
So, obviously with regard to legislation in California, there's good news and bad news. Just for those people who haven't been following it, I think there was a legislation passed around 2016, 2017 that mandated certain minimum women directors on boards. That's ongoing. That's being disputed in the court. But as a result of that, and I'll say it this way, because of the awareness of the issue, I look at the numbers, and 5 years after that legislation passed, the number of women on boards almost doubled. So and the number of companies that had women on boards that had none doubled. So it had an effect, partly because of legislation, also partly because of the awareness. I believe part of the awareness. There was a similar legislation that was passed, some story here, for minorities, that mirrored the same language as in the women's. Okay, bad news is that was ruled unconstitutional, but the good news and bad news, is the last couple of years we've seen the same sort of happen with African Americans on boards. I talked to David Chun because I was about the latest data, and he said, yeah, last couple of years actually the number of African Americans very small and not enough. But again, the awareness, open the aperture of people making aware that, hey, this is an issue people care about, change. Unfortunately, it hasn't changed much for Hispanics and Asian Americans, but we'll get there. Okay, but it does make a difference to people looking at us. It's our need to be sure that our voices heard, because clearly Blacks, Hispanics, and women made their voice heard because people listen. And certainly my belief, and just because I'm a corporate guy, most people mean well. I really do. So you just have to get them aware of the issue and aware of solutions that can be made.
Yeah, and thank you for all the work that you're doing to increase that awareness and advocacy. Vanessa, what can we learn from Australia in terms of mandates versus goals towards this objective?
I think so much of seeing what has happened in Australia is the fact that there have been so many influencers around the corporate sector and also in government who've affected it. So interestingly enough, in Australia, there's actually their government boards, there is a mandate there where women have to occupy 40% of the seats for government boards. That hasn't translated over to the corporate sector, but it certainly has influenced so many people in the private sector to say, well, shouldn't we be having the same thing? And the institutional investors, because they see what's happening in the government, they see also, well, I want to make sure that we're going to tick the box when we talk to our pension funds, for instance, about where are we fulfilling those mandates. They're looking at that too. And so now it's becoming reported. Even though it's not a requirement, all of these companies now report how many women are on the board. So I think the confluence of factors of pressure from investors, pressure from the press as well, pressure from the business community has now just led to this accepted, it's like an accepted requirement that you have to make sure your boards are diverse from a gender lens. And so it's very interesting to see. And I think like every country, every region, every geography has its own idiosyncrasies. If you look at Scandinavia, I think in Norway, it's 40, there's a mandate where it has to be at least 40% of women are on boards. I spent a lot of time in Europe for many years, and especially in the Netherlands, and they also have requirements in place because they don't have the same confluence of factors. But I think that's something to learn from, and thinking about other APEC countries that haven't put in mandates just yet. I think Australia provides a nice kind of like a path to how do you then make boards more diverse in a short period of time.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from other countries around the world as we do this comparative analysis. And it's a good reminder, I think you said about pension funds, right? The asset managers are really behind diversity on boards and continue to be. And part of that's not just demographic kinds of diversity. And so we'll share with you next a little bit of the data around board composition globally. And so we're looking at different statistics ranging from the number of directors on a board to the time that they've been on the board, as well as the level of independence. And what we're seeing is very interesting, in fact, that the average board size is smaller in many countries in Asia-Pac relative to Mexico and the US, so the Americas. In addition to that, the percentage of independent directors is lower in Hong Kong, Mexico, and some of the Asia-Pac countries relative to the US, where the average size, or average number of independent directors is 86%. The average tenure is lower in some of the Asia-Pac countries relative, again, to the US and Mexico. And then lastly, the average age is pretty flat, around 60. So there's not a lot of variation there. So as we consider some of those board composition statistics, I might turn to you, Chitra, to talk about how you think the number of directors, as well as the average age, impacts diversity on boards.
So approaching first the question of age really is just a number. And I was very pleased to read that the NACD guidance and some of the other guidance you read even in the US pretty much says that. So we have, Carolyn and I actually have in common somebody who used to be on our Coke board, who's now on my trucking company board. He is 81, and he was the CEO of Delta Airlines, and he's incredibly sharp. And he is a mentor to the CEO. And the whole board, he's offered to step off the board, but the whole board said, no, we need you here, right? So I think that thinking through age is a very individual sort of thought process, and I'm glad that currently guidance seems to be reflecting that. I do think that tenure is something that boards do need to pay attention to. For instance, in India, at Infosys, we have a 3 or 5 year first term, and then a 5-year second term, and that is it, no matter how valuable the person is. And what that does, of course, as one would recognize, is keep thinking while still having people who are very knowledgeable about the company there. And it's important, therefore, as NomGov, to look at the composition from a tenure perspective, as well as on an individual basis, is age mattering or not? We have another board member who's 80, who's also very sharp, but he has Parkinson's, and he said he thinks he has 2 years left in him, right? And he's very sharp while he's there, but it is a consideration. So that's kind of what I would say about both the age and the tenure. I think it's important to observe the mix when it comes to tenure, so that you get the best of both new thinking and people who know your company well.
Really good points that you make. And Vanessa, maybe a little bit from you in terms of how the lower percentage of independent directors might be impacting diversity in Asia Pac.
Yeah, interestingly enough, in Australia, it's actually a high number of independent directors there, but just looking at the various nomcoms that I've been sitting on, every time there is that board seat that's coming up, it is a very rare opportunity to bring in fresh thinking, to really think about the skills that you need to enhance not just that of the board, but also just that of the management team, to bring in those perspectives. So those opportunities, of course, are fewer, the fewer independent board seats you have, and then you're just beholden to what is in the company. So I think that if you look at, like the data that you have with like Hong Kong and Japan, Mexico, where they're lower, like, is there a way to work with those types of companies to make sure every time a seat does come free, that there is a lot of thought around what does that board composition look like, instead of, I think, what Buck, you were saying, the Hollywood example, right? Just defaulting to your network. Like, those are each very, very prominent opportunities to change the landscape.
Really good advice. And Buck, you talk a little bit about tools. Maybe tell us about how tools can be used to drive more board diversity. I'm thinking of Equilar.
Oh, okay. So, the issue is that if you don't know who's out there, you're not going to find them. Okay. So that's one of the things that a good friend of mine, David Chun, has an organization called Equilar, and what they do is they have a database of all the directors. So in fact, if there are people outside your network that you want to find, you can go talk to David and he'll say your service, but he makes money on it. But he has a partnership with NASDAQ. And so and NASDAQ has realized this is an important issue. You know, they came out with their, I'm not sure it's guidance or regulations or whatever, a few years ago, that NASDAQ companies need to report diversity on boards, just so you have the data, so that they think about, from me perspective, so they think about it. And so people are aware about it, and people care about it, they'll complain. But so that's why NASDAQ is partnering with Equilar to do that. But yeah, there are tools out there. If you want to find diverse board candidates, you can find them. Okay, either that or hire Gina or somebody, but.
And we'll talk about a few colleagues that I have in the room that we'd love for you to meet.
Sorry to.
Fair enough. And I think the last topic that we'll just touch briefly on is just broader corporate governance issues today, globally and in Asia Pac, and then we'll open it up in just a few minutes to the audience to ask questions. So, maybe I'll just highlight a couple of the issues in Asia Pac, in particular in Singapore and Malaysia. There's a prevention here occurring of long-serving independent directors from becoming entrenched. In India, there's this cliff approaching where there's going to be lots of people coming off of boards after a 10-year term. And in Australia, heightened board vigilance in response to the external environment, which is, I think, a trend that we're seeing globally. I'm going to ask if there's anyone who would like to comment on some of that broad board governance topic on the panel as we conclude the formal remarks and move to Q&A.
I think just thinking about, I think cybersecurity has come up. I was just at a board. It's like a board. Women actually is a group called Extraordinary Women on Boards. Yep. And so there was an event a couple of nights ago in New York, and we were just talking to some attorneys about some of the most pressing issues, and literally the ones that are coming up. It's litigation around DEI now because of what has happened, as at least like in the United States with the SCOTUS decision when it comes to affirmative action in schools. That's something that's come up, and you're starting to see actions taken on the corporate sector. Cybersecurity remains such an incredibly important topic, and making sure that as board members, you are asking the right questions. I think in Australia, there have been a few instances where like there was perception that the boards have been asleep at the wheel. And so there really is heightened vigilance around that. And I would love to hear from my fellow panel members about just the role of AI and what does that mean and how do you embrace that, but at the same time address all of the risks affiliated with it too.
Those are really important points you bring up. Is there something you'd like to add?
I do, but before I go into the point I was going to make, it was interesting to read Biden's executive order on AI, which as yet doesn't say much, but hopefully will say a lot in the coming year. So I think there's a lot to come on the regulatory side, and I was reading some guidance that it would be a good thing for companies and their boards to start thinking very hard about an AI ethics code of conduct and things like that. So, but AI aside, Tina and I were talking about the human capital proposal that's come out with the SEC, with the thinking that actually human capital is an asset that is very important for any investor to know about. And it's increasingly important, therefore, that any company should be able to disclose what its retention is like, or how many people is it losing, what are the demographics of that population, and all those elements that actually are very common sense if you were an investor that you'd want to know about. So similarly, in terms of the NASDAQ SEC ruling, which a court upheld last month, the court, I was reading the transcript and it sounded like the court saying, as an investor, you have the right to know how diverse your board is. You may individually, as an investor, not care maybe about how it impacts financial profitability of your company, but you have a right to know. And so I think increasingly some of these disclosures are because the investment community needs to know, which makes perfect sense logically.
Yeah, and I think an increasing area of governance for boards going forward, especially as the SCOTUS decision puts a lot of pressure on activists, both right and left, for shareholder proposals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think boards are really going to need to govern this issue much more going forward. Any final thoughts on this issue before we turn to the audience for some questions?
I'll just add quickly on Vanessa's comment related to AI. There's a software collaboration company out there called Atlassian, and they just issued, if any of you are interested, they just issued a kind of principles or framework around developing AI inside of your organization. So maybe more operational, but even at a board level, you can think about the risks, the key stakeholders, right? The product development and technology process is a very useful document that you can check out.
That's terrific. And Atlassian is definitely a call-out company, especially in Australia, as I was there a couple of weeks ago, because of their fully distributed work model, which I know is a big topic in the boardroom as well. Let's open it up to the audience. I don't know if there's a mic available for anyone who would like to ask questions. There's one up front here.
Is the disparity between Australia and Europe and the US? In the US, in terms of board representation, more diverse. So why would the US be so divergent from Australia and Europe? What's your take on it?
So a couple of things. One, in the UK and Australia, I might draw on the Parker Review, which was a basically call by the government for more diversity for gender diversity on boards many years ago. And that was very effective because there was no kind of legislation requirement. And so I think it didn't receive a backlash. I'd be curious for Vanessa to add on Australia, but the one thing I'll say about the US, and the panel might have a comment as well, is that we've made a lot more progress on underrepresented minority diversity that other countries have not. And that's not listed in the statistics we shared because it's hard to do a comparative analysis. Who would like to add to that as well?
Yeah, I think like the notion of underrepresented minorities on boards, it seems to be, at least like in the work that I've done a little bit in Europe and in Australia, seems to be very much like a US conversation. I wish it could be more of a conversation in Australia on the boards that I sit on. I literally just say, well, how about like ethnic diversity? Can we report on that even in our US activities? And then they look at me just like I'm a deer in headlights. I'm like, no, this is really important. And this is something that so many people care about, at least for the US markets. I do think that it's interesting to think about Australia, where I think it's a culture where I would bet that if there were a mandate in place, there would have been a lot more of a backlash. just even looking at a few weeks ago, they had this vote on whether or not people who were indigenous were going to get a voice and be recognized. And even though they have like land acknowledgements and have accepted them as into the culture, the moment they said, we're going to put that into law, they said no. And so I think that looking at how Australia did it was very much tied to what they thought was going to make change. And I think it's just something to think about. If I don't know which countries you are active in, I'd love to know like what you see or some of the differences. Ah. Yes.
Leadership, and I understand it's regulation. It was voted. It's right. But my question is really, why is the U.S. lagging
On gender diversity?
On gender and diversity in general, at the board level? Why? I've been here 40 years. I've been on the tour and in Silicon Valley, what's happening. And I don't think Silicon Valley is that diverse, right? But your personal opinion about why?
Yeah, anyone?
I'm not the woman, you know. So I'm looking at their answer.
And I might answer. Go ahead.
So part of the problem, not the whole problem. Part of the problem is the failure of women. I don't mean the failure of women to make it to higher level positions. When you're looking for boards, you're looking for CEOs, CFOs, CXOs, right? So part of the problem is a pipeline problem that's inherently in the system, systemic bias against women. Okay, so getting more people at the top will get them into the boardroom. But part of the problem right now, at least that I'm working on, is the systemic bias for women minorities in the pipeline system. So there are more women now. There are actually not as many, but principally a lot of that is white women. Most of the progress in getting through the pipeline is for white women. Black, Hispanic, and Asian women have made virtually no progress in going through the pipeline. That's what I focus on, is the corporate leadership. So when that is fixed, you'll see more women, Black, Hispanic, and white women, and Asian women in the boardroom.
Yeah, now just build on that. We track the diversity of the C-suite roles around the 100 largest companies in the S&P 500, and we most often see women in HR roles, in marketing roles, and the feeder roles are CFO roles, general management, CEO, et cetera. The other thing I'll add is that, in France with the Law Rexon, there's a push to diversify now the management committees of the companies. And so I think the legislation did make a difference both at the board level, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out at the executive level. There was another question, I think, in the back.
Hello, hi. First of all, thank you so much for the whole panelists for the wonderful advice and your insights. But I just would like to follow up with the last question about why so few women on the board. And I have just general question. Two questions are related. One is that if the board, the panelists could share your personal, opinion about two sides for with the CEO executives here. How do they overcome the hurdle, like to consider a board candidate has no experience with a board experience whatsoever. So that's tied to what Bob said, that the pipeline, for the minority or women is already very few, but a few of them has experience. So I suppose companies are reluctant to consider new board candidates, let alone being minority or women. And the other side of the coin is that, how do you advise women or minority board candidate, or who are inspiring, want to be a board member, give them advice how to advocate for themselves? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that question?
Which part of the question?
Lots of good questions in there. Which part would you like to take?
To the latter question, how do you advocate for yourself? I mean, the real, again, the issue is getting in the network and finding people or finding organizations or finding projects that, like Ascend Pinnacle, and I'm sure Catalyst has similar programs as well. So you can get into the network. So, because unless they know who you are, they're not going to find you. Or you're also this way. You'll increase your odds if you get into the network, right? And because they'll know who you are. And if you have, and again, once they have a relationship with you, then they're more willing to, if Carolyn knows you, and knows a little bit about you, she's probably more willing to put you in the hat versus getting, a resume across her desk saying, here's a candidate. So build those relationships with board directors, like Carolyn.
I think on your first question, you alluded to the fact that there's like a high hurdle, right, to even promote diversity in the boardroom. And I completely agree with that personally, right? If there's a lack of, then it's hard to kind of cross that threshold. One of the things that I've done is, and received exec coach advice on this, is really to get yourself out there, even in terms of kind of your own career and operational leadership and what you can share with your experience, your subject matter expertise, right? I think that, when boards are looking for that, they get to know you through forums and speaking events, conferences, and things like that.
We're going to have time for one last question. Before we turn to that question, I just wanted to mention also that I'm very proud of our firm at Russell Reynolds and the investment that the firm has made over many years, even before I joined, in this particular area. And I am joined by some colleagues in the room that if you are interested in a board, I would love for you to introduce yourselves. And I'd like to ask each of them to wave their hands. We've got Chris Farrelly, the head of our San Francisco Bay Area office, in the back. Tuck Rickards, the head of our technology practice globally. Harry Lin, the head of our technology practice out of Hong Kong. He's here just for APEC this week. And Rohit Gupta, who has been amazing in organizing this whole panel here in our Bay Area offices in the technology sector. Don't think I missed anyone, but if I did, we're here to really meet everyone here who might be interested. And we have time for, I think, one last question up here. Back here, yes, okay.
Oh, stand up. Hi, back my last company, working AI. I guess the question is like, what mechanisms have you guys seen does work well to try out new board members in a diverse setting? Is it about like, we call that board observer role? Is it about like a probation period? And like, especially in a high growth environment, because I think, if a steady ship, then maybe can like take our time, but if we're doing that, then how to make it work? Thank you.
Good question.
So I've seen on one of my late stage venture capital boards that they will bring on an independent, most of the board is of course VCs, private equity, but they will bring on an independent for a year and then have a conversation to see if what they had seen on both sides was actually delivering the value that both sides thought it would deliver. I haven't seen a probationary kind of board member construct, so that's one possible approach where you're not going to end up in a long-term relationship without there being value.
One thing that I've experienced and seen is bringing on someone who might be an advisory role, so board advisor, I think you mentioned, or advisor to the company, and then working with that person to see whether they can become an independent board member for a venture-backed company or high growth situation. Sometimes it's a hard switch, right? An advisory role, you might be very hands-on, very operational, and then once you're on the board, it may be a slightly different story and in terms of governance. But that is one way.
Any other thoughts before I add one comment to that, which is I think, we're here in a public-private partnership, and I think one of the things that we saw when the California Diversity on Boards legislation was in place, we were getting lots of inbounds to say, okay, we've got to meet both requirements. And for the first time that I can remember, the public company boards were open to people who didn't have private or prior board experience. And so I think, that push and advocacy from the public side to affect change on the private side can be really important. And I think addresses both of the last questions that were asked. And with that, we'd like to just ask you to thank the panelists for their time and contributions to our discussion today. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think they may be available for a few minutes afterwards as we conclude this session here, but thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for being here this morning, everyone. We'll be concluding with our final session of APEC Meets Silicon Valley in approximately 15 minutes with innovation and global startups in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley Bay Area.